Hi, John. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and have this conversation with me, especially on such short notice. I decided over the weekend that I wanted to make sort of a special episode for my podcast about the tragic death of Lazar at the 2024 CrossFit Games on Thursday. As someone who participates in CrossFit at a CrossFit affiliate, and I have for quite a while. It's a pretty, small but important part of my life. And the moment that I heard about this happening, my heart obviously went out to his family, to his friends, to everybody who competed with him and knew him, and obviously was going through a tremendous amount of, emotional turmoil and suffering. But then my next thought was about everyone else in the CrossFit ecosystem, right? Everyone whose livelihood is connected to the CrossFit brand. I think that it's really easy in this moment to focus on what CrossFit did or failed to do in this specific instance. But my concern, right, is that in focusing only on this, that we might be too reactive instead of being proactive in addressing issues that you have raised for quite some time about culture in CrossFit, about sort of a dysfunctional communication and relationship between, affiliates and the corporation, leadership within the corporation, that, is threatening, sort of the well-being of this brand that so many people have invested so much into, including yourself. So you are an affiliate owner. You are, I don't know if you would appreciate me thinking of you this way, but I do think of you as like a CrossFit influencer, in the sense that, while you bring, you bring out the humorous side of CrossFit, you are also somebody that I know this community, the CrossFit community, looks to when things happen concerning changes, to get your take. And I think that's because you generally have a really thoughtful, intelligent, well thought, well reasoned take on things. So this is me coming to you to ask a bunch of questions. So I really appreciate it.
Yes.
So you were one of many people who was actually watching Event 1 on Thursday. Could you just, again, we don't necessarily need to go through all the details, but if you could just share what you observed and what sort of you experienced watching the events unfold.
Well, it was obviously very traumatic. I mean, I had planned my whole day around sitting on the couch eating snacks and watching fitness. There's always the irony of sitting around with donuts and watching other people work out. And that was kind of my plan. And I was texting friends through the whole thing. Ironically, I was sitting there texting Sean Woodland. I don't know if you know Sean, but he's kind of the voice of the CrossFit Games. And so we were in active communication from the very beginning because we were planning to do a post-day recap every day during the games. And so I was kind of uncharacteristically taking notes. Like, I'm notoriously don't plan for my own podcast, but because this one involved actual competition that needed details and names and faces and that sort of thing, I was taking notes. And over the course of the notes, noticed that it seemed like safety protocol was lacking. Like right from the very beginning, I was messaging Sean asking, why are some of the athletes wearing hats and others aren't? Like, they're wearing their swim caps. And it turns out that the competition required them to carry their swim caps through the entirety of the run before they got in the water. So some of the athletes lost their caps. Other athletes were wearing them. Some were in their pockets. And, we were just kind of discussing back and forth the danger of running in a ski cap because, the heat escapes through your head, and it was a hot day. And then I knew there'd be people getting in the water without caps on, which was also kind of odd because then you wouldn't be able to see them as well. And as we started to watch the swim unfold, I was messaging him and saying how wide the swim lane was and how it seemed careless to me that they were allowing athletes to swim, dozens, hundreds of meters off course. Like there were kind of athletes all over the place. And I just noted in my notes that it didn't seem the safest because they couldn't cover enough ground. But, like everyone else, I don't think I had a lot of concerns at the moment. I was just taking notes. Like I wasn't worried about the safety of the athletes necessarily as much as I was just noting it didn't seem safe. You never think, I mean, these athletes are superheroes to us. It never occurs to us, I think, that they could get injured. And as athletes started coming out, Sean messaged me and said, hey, I think they're missing an athlete. And that's when we realized things had gone horribly, horribly wrong. And it's hard to put into words. Initially, again, they're like superheroes to us, so it just didn't seem real. Sean and I are both like, okay, well, maybe his chip timer came off and no one saw him, and he's going to turn up at his hotel, like that. Those were our initial thoughts. And then when we realized pretty quickly that that wasn't the case, those kind of hopeful feelings quickly turned to dread, and it was horrifying. I mean, there's just no better word for it, just an absolutely horrifying thought and moment for all of us. I think for the entire community. I summed it up to someone earlier today, calling it a loss of innocence. And that's really what it feels like to me. Like we've, had this, over a decade of the games where we've watched these athletes do some of the most amazing feats of fitness, and well-deserved. And there have been plenty of close call moments over the years, but no one's, nothing like this has ever happened. And the fact that it actually happened gave us a real dose of reality that, it is just a sport, and it somehow became life and death, and it's just not worth it.
So you bring up, I think, a important point for people that maybe are not familiar with CrossFit or with the games, which is that the CrossFit Games has been going on for, close to 15 years. That's not actually that long of a time. When we think about, other sports leagues, CrossFit is a very new sport, and it's been sort of commercially viable, right? Even a shorter time than that, and has been getting, national media attention for a shorter time than that. So what do you see as the role of the CrossFit Games and other, competitions in CrossFit in sort of the broader CrossFit ecosystem, which isn't just about competition, right? It is largely not about elite athletes competing. And yet, we still have these sort of main event competitions. Right. So what role do they play?
Well, the CrossFit Games plays a much different role than, say, a local competition. I think a local competition fills the void for, I make this joke all the time, like CrossFit's just full of former high school athletes trying to relive their glory, myself included, right? Like it's no secret there. So I think that local competitions often fill that space. They also, to some degree, probably fill in some revenue gaps for some of those businesses and allow people to test what they've been training for, which is also pretty important when you think about it. There are a lot of people that want to test the things they've been working on, such as gymnastics or weightlifting or whatever it may be. The CrossFit Games is different in the fact that it's I guess I would call it an example or a demonstration of the definition of fitness. So, CrossFit believes, and I believe, that we've defined fitness and what it truly means. And CrossFit Games allows us to demonstrate kind of the extreme perspective of that, meaning what we define as fitness, this constantly varied, across all time domains mentality applies to you and I the same way it applies to the athletes that compete at the CrossFit Games. But you and I are nowhere near at the level that they are. Like they're just, have taken it to the most extreme level. And so I think it allows us to show the world what's possible. Men, women, age groups, masters, teens, adaptive athletes, all of them. And so I do think it's important to have the games in that regard because it allows us to showcase what we know to be, the most efficient, fastest, and we believe the best methodology around fitness. I think it does some damage to the brand at times because because it's a sport and what we do in the gym is not sport. But people see the CrossFit games, they go, okay, well, that's CrossFit. Someone got injured, CrossFit's dangerous. When the reality is, there's an injury rate for all sports, and CrossFit's no more dangerous than the rest of them. Neither are our gyms, but there's a little bit of that plays out because of, you see people climbing 20-foot ropes and tossing heavy weights overhead. It makes people nervous. But I do think it has its place in helping us build out the business and help people understand what we're doing. And there are people that crave it. They see it and they go, I want to go do that. I want to do what that person is doing. There's something empowering about, seeing strong men and women and seeing if you can achieve that. And so I think it certainly has its place and should be part of the CrossFit ecosystem.
So in recent years, more so, I think, than in the beginning, there is a group of individuals, right, who, and obviously that's a constantly evolving group, but there is a group of individuals who, I think of as professional CrossFit athletes. There's kind of a resistance to referring to them as professionals. I think generally they're referred to as elite CrossFit athletes. But what are your thoughts on that? And, if you also similarly would classify a certain group of CrossFit athletes as professionals, like what distinguishes a professional CrossFit athlete from, the rest of us?
Probably a couple of things. I mean, the biggest one is, are you making money or not? I mean, that's the only thing that truly makes you, professional. There's a lot of amateur CrossFit athletes that are doing comps all over the place, but aren't really making money at it. And the truth is, even the professionals aren't making a lot of money. This is not a sport that's, got enough money behind it yet where people are retiring early. Like we have a couple athletes that are, notably Matt Frazier or Tia Claire Toomey, maybe Rich Froning, some of those, but I think over the the grand scheme of the sport, most of the athletes aren't making a ton of money, but I would consider them professional, if it is a significant income stream for them, and if depending on the amount of time they're dedicating to it. Like the needs of a normal CrossFit athlete, like I'll just use myself, I'm very normal. It's 4 to 5 days a week, right? You train 5 days a week, take a couple of rest days, eat healthy, and you're good to go. These games athletes these days, they're training 6 to 8 hours a day sometimes. And it's, all of that isn't just training. Some of that's body work, right? So like they may come in the morning and do a workout and then have a midday swim and an evening workout. And all of that equates to about an hour and a half to 2 hours worth of working out. But in between that, they're, going to mobility training and gymnastics training and, whatever. And, kind of constantly in training mode, working toward a goal, which is to qualify for the CrossFit Games. So I think if you're spending that kind of effort and time to compete and your goal is the CrossFit Games, I would absolutely consider you a professional CrossFitter.
Right. And also additional streams of revenue that are tied to CrossFit, right? Whether
Sure.
that might be coaching at an affiliate, owning an affiliate, having brand relationships, right? All of that, though, is tied to their competition in CrossFit, even
Mm-hmm.
if they're not earning like in prize money a
Right.
significant portion of their income from CrossFit. So, there is, and we've talked about this, an organization, the PFAA, the Professional Fitness Athletes Association, who advocates for athlete safety
Mm-hmm.
and, general protection within the sport. Could you tell me more about that organization? I know that you've spoken with them in the past, worked with them. Maybe tell me a little bit about what their reaction has been to this event, what they kind of have planned for the future. Obviously, they're probably still figuring a lot of that out.
Right. Yeah, the PFAA is a great organization. I haven't done a ton of work with them. I reached out to them today to offer more help. To be honest, they advocate for um, athlete safety, and if I had to sum them up into like kind of two or three talking points, it would be athlete safety is a top priority. Helping athletes figure out how to make a living within the sport is a priority for them. And then, providing support to the athletes in general is a priority for them. So they try to collaborate with competitions and not just CrossFit. These athletes are competing in other competitions like Wadapalooza as an example. And so they're partnering with these larger comps to ensure those things are happening and to be an advocate for um, those CrossFitters. I'm not sure what is next for them currently. I know, much like the rest of us, they're a small organization. They're heartbroken. They're trying to provide resources right now. If you look at their website, they're offering kind of links to therapy and links to um, the GoFundMe for Lazar's family, and kind of doing the right thing in that regard. And I know that they are certainly getting together to talk about what next steps are. I would imagine, and I'm completely speculating here, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, is an event like this is going to cause the athletes to want to mobilize more than ever before. And that's really, in my opinion, been the underlying cause of why they probably haven't had as much impact as they want to have. Is, you've got to rally the troops to get that stuff done. And there has to be a reason. And, again, there's not a lot of money in the sport. So I think it's hard to get athletes to invest time in something that isn't training and doesn't earn them income necessarily, and to see the vision. And when a traumatic event like this happens, it's tragic and heartbreaking. I think they're going to have an opportunity to mobilize some of those athletes that have a big voice in the community that can help the cause and move it forward. So if there's there aren't a lot of silver linings in an event like this, but if there is one, that would be it. Is that meaningful change can come through a group of people coming together and demanding that it happens. And so my hope is that more athletes get really involved in the PFAA and have a voice and move it forward.
Yeah, and because right now, right, there's no actual system of checks and balances on how CrossFit as a corporation kind of manages the sport of CrossFit, right? Whether that is programming workouts or even changing the kind of terms and conditions of competition, right? We've seen that games eligibility, how you kind of punch your ticket to the games, has changed pretty dramatically over the last 6 years. Um, there's really nobody who, any third party that other than the PFAA, that has any sort of oversight function or athlete advocacy role within CrossFit as a sport.
Yeah, as far as I know, there isn't.
Right.
I think they've had to athletes for a long time prior to the PFA had to just advocate for themselves,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is bluntly impossible to do.
Right. So, one of the things that you have said, and you've said this on social media, so I feel comfortable bringing it up here,
Right.
is that there are cultural issues within CrossFit HQ that contributed to this tragedy. Can you tell me more about that culture? I mean, I know in past episodes of your podcast, you've talked about the lack of transparency, the lack of communication. Um, is that really specifically what you're referring to? Is there more?
Oh, it's all over the board, and a lot of it's starting to unfold with this tragedy. Like athletes are starting to be bolder in describing the things that they have struggled with. I've seen multiple posts today alone from athletes that are complaining is the wrong word, that are discussing that in the past they've approached CrossFit about safety concerns and have been ignored, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, that would be a small example, and it's not that small, but it'd be an example of, kind of a culture that doesn't listen to its constituents. I think that's been a common plague for them for a long period of time, that they don't always seem to hear what people are telling them. Um, and, some of this is anecdotal, but and some isn't. I really like the CEO. I've talked to him multiple times, had him on my show 2 or 3 times, and have met him in person half a dozen. And I think he's genuine, caring. I think he's a thoughtful leader. I think he wants to change the culture within CrossFit. And when I've talked to him about it, he's mentioned a couple of things. One was that he wanted to build what he's describing servant leadership within the organization, which I think is was his way of telling me they're not humble enough and that they need to learn to serve others, not serve themselves. And he also mentioned to me that he is trying to build a culture, which ties into this, of, when they make a decision, it's okay to debate it and argue it. But once you make the decision, you all stick together and lock arms around it, which again, I think is speaking to a culture that he's recognizing that this is a very siloed business where people are trying to get credit for their individual widgets and don't really care about the greater cause, which is pretty common in corporate America for the record. And, probably, CrossFit's no different in that regard. And so I think he's fighting those two things from a cultural standpoint. And now you're in a different era altogether where you had a company that was owned under private ownership for 20 years and then sold to private equity and, gets an external CEO coming in trying to change that culture. And so you still have a pretty significant part of the business that is under that old guard mentality of the way it used to be. And, you're bringing in new people from the outside with degrees from Yale and Harvard and wherever that are, super qualified that are now having to, kind of fight that mentality. And so I think, that right now again, I'm speculating, but I know people there and I've talked, I've heard some of this from the inside that there's a kind of an internal battle waging over, which culture are we going to be? And I think you see it across, the business in a multitude of ways, whether it's the way they handle their media or the way they respond to people, whether it's athletes or just, individual affiliates, or the fact that maybe they don't respond at all. So culturally, I think they just have a long way to go from really hearing what the community needs from them.
Yeah. I definitely agree that change management in any organization is very difficult. And change management in an organization that is, I think, really tied up in people's passions, and their interests, their community, their life is even, I think, more difficult.
You know,
Um,
I'll tell you what I think the real problem is. I was just talking to Sean again today, and we had this discussion, and I used this weird analogy for him, but it was in my mind because we're in a political cycle. And this is not a political discussion, so I'm not taking us down a rabbit hole. But when Greg owned the company, Greg was notoriously libertarian, and in my opinion, ran the business kind of under the same philosophy you would get from a Republican administration, which is you want less government, less oversight. You're just going to let the people loose and the survival of the fittest. Like that was kind of his mentality. And so if you signed up for an affiliation within CrossFit, you pay your affiliation fee, and really all you got for it was protection from CrossFit from outside influences, but you got no direction on how to run the company. Well, in the kind of the new leadership, I think they're taking a more democratic approach, which is you have more bureaucracy and, you're building a lot of infrastructure and a lot of rules around that. And you're building up HQ and, so you're building more government. And so I think fundamentally that shift between those two mindsets is a real interesting dynamic to watch it unfold. And I think that's where a lot of this, culture problem is coming from, that, shifting from the old to the new. And it's, people don't like change always. They resist it given the opportunity.
it's true. So I also, you raised something that I think, I intuitively understand as someone who's done CrossFit and watched a lot of CrossFit. But you mentioned a lack of responsiveness to safety concerns. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on the extent to which culture of CrossFit plays into that lack of responsiveness. So I watched the clip of Pat Vellner um, in the Buttery Brothers show where he said um, that it's not war, it's sport, and that it shouldn't be like this. I should have probably looked up the
Yeah.
exact quote. I'll provide it, but that also they've raised safety concerns, been patted on the head, and told not to worry so much. So I'm wondering whether you think there is a culture of pushing athletes, these seemingly superhuman athletes, right, to the farthest place that they can go. Um, Whether that is a part of the culture, and whether you've noticed kind of in the last, several years that you've been a part of CrossFit, like the programming for the games has evolved. I know you have general thoughts on programming
Sure.
for
Yeah.
the games, but I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think it's part of the history. I'm not sure culture's the right word, but if you look back at the history of the company in the early days, our mascot was a clown that was puking. They literally named Pukey, and that was the mindset of CrossFit in those early days, that you go as hard as you can right up to the point of failure at all times, right? Or at least that's the way it was delivered in the gym. Whether that was the way it was taught or not, I couldn't tell you. But I can tell you my experience when I started in 2011 was my coach would literally sit there and scream at me if I wasn't working till almost vomiting status. Like, that was the way it was. And now in today's environment, if you even go to their website, instead of saying Forging Elite Fitness, which used to be the tagline, now it says Fitness that Sticks, or Fitness for Everyone. Like, it's far more inclusive language. And so they're trying to soften what's going on in the gym so people understand that you can scale workouts and that you can not work to failure, and it's okay. And you can, kind of fitness at your own level. And that wasn't true in those days. Well, the point to that is that a lot of people running the games are from that old school. Specifically, Dave Castro, who, created the games, has been around from day one, is part of that old guard. And the games have continued to get harder and harder and harder, as you would expect. We're testing fitness, right? So if you test it one year, you want to increase the test. Like, it's no different than college. Like, it gets harder as you go along. Right? So there is a little bit of that, but I do think there is, and it's certainly been prevalent, mindset that, to Pat's point, you're working, it's treated like war. You're working to the hardest possible place as opposed to making it a competition. And so I think there have certainly been moments over the years where we've all looked at it and said, man, why are they doing this? Never obviously imagining that would come to the moment we had this weekend by any stretch of the imagination, but have certainly seen it continue to escalate in its difficulty. And to be fair to the games team, the athletes are getting better and are far more capable now than they would have been 10 years ago. So, there's a little fairness to say that the game should be getting harder. The athletes are getting better, but
harder and dangerous, right, are not always the same
yeah,
thing. It
two
comes to
different things.
programming, and that's something I am I'm mindful of when I watch the games, right? I thought some of the events in last year's games were really challenging to athletes in different ways, right? The parallel um, inclusion, the double under crossovers, certainly those threw even really experienced athletes for a loop in a way that was both entertaining and also, I think, within the spirit of CrossFit competition. So, because, I'm thinking about this from, like my legal brain has been contemplating all of this. I have struggled to see so many people commenting, and I know you should never read the comments, but we all make that mistake. But commenting that Lazar's family will get millions of dollars, that it's a sure bet that, this was negligent, that this is like a slam dunk legally, and that CrossFit is screwed. Um, you know, it's always hard for me when I see people, I don't know, sort of leaning on the law in this way, or also kind of attaching sort of this morality to the law that it doesn't really always exist. Um, and so, I wanted to talk, I think it's important to talk a little bit about like the legal realities um, of what a civil claim for negligence might look like. I know you're not a lawyer. I'm not asking you to be. I have some specific questions
Right.
that am interested to know your thoughts on. So one of and actually you may know this as someone who has been there in a media capacity, you probably had to sign a waiver.
Mhm.
One of the issues that will undoubtedly come up, or maybe it won't. Maybe CrossFit will, do the ethical thing and settle, with Lazar's family for, a fair and appropriate sum in response to a civil claim. But if they decide to move forward and litigate in some fashion this claim, an issue will undoubtedly arise that there is an assumption of risk uh, inherent in this type of competition. The most recent example of a CrossFit Games waiver that I could find online is from 2016, but I doubt they've made big edits. And it contains an express assumption of risk provision, which Texas courts will enforce. And again, I'm making an assumption that any cause of action would be brought in Texas, but that's what lawyers sometimes have to do.
Yeah.
There's also a liability waiver for all harm, even harm caused by negligence. So the thing about assumption of risk and the doctrine of assumption of risk is that athletes only assume the risk of commonly appreciated risks that are inherent and arise out of the nature of the sport generally. Right from the outset, I see a problem there with trying to say what those risks are, right? Because CrossFit is about being prepared for the unknown and the unknowable. There are always twists and turns and new implements and new movements introduced at the games. Now, death is probably not one of the inherent risks of participation in CrossFit, but what would you say as a CrossFit participant and someone who's seen a lot of competitions? What would you say the risks inherent in the sport are that a competitor could reasonably foresee?
Well, I mean, we've seen it all over the years. I mean, I think most people would just assume that, kind of your run of the mill injury is what you would expect. Like we've seen everything from torn ACLs to blood clots to, wrecks on bikes, that sort of thing over the years.
Heat exhaustion.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We've definitely seen heat exhaustion a couple of times, and there have been a few near misses when it comes to people having experiences in the water, as an example. I don't think, to your point, I don't think anyone expects death to be part of it, but we've seen people like last year at one of these Masters events. My gym partner, Tom, who happens to be a doctor, was there in medical capacity, and one of the athletes had a heart attack right in the middle of the workout, and Tom revived him on the floor. It's like that's the reality of a sport where you're going this hard for a long period of time, is that it puts a real stress on your system. Saw a guy at the games 2 years ago had a stroke on the floor. Emily Roth, who finished third this year, had a blood clot and had to have emergency surgery. So there's certainly some pretty big risks that come with competing that I think everyone understands are part of it. I don't think there's anyone in the community that would have expected this. Like I don't know. I mean, I certainly didn't. I don't want to speculate on it too much, but I think that the community at large, I think, is really, really probably most upset because there was no chance to save
Right.
or effort that I could see. Um, it's like kind of the point of, like the guy who had the heart attack, like Tom was working on him immediately and thankfully was able to revive him. But I think had he not been able to revive him, people would have understood because medical protocol was there. They were immediately on it, immediately getting to work. And, so life happens sometimes, but an event like this where it doesn't even get noticed.
Right.
Or,
Well, and right, and right now it's unknown to us, and it may be forever, whether there was any other medical issue that
right.
contributed to the events. But you are actually starting to answer my next question, which is that another aspect of assumption of risk is that when you assume the risk, and when you expressly state that you assume the risk of harm in engaging in any particular activity, that doesn't include actions that increase the risks already inherent in the sport. So based on, what you observed, what you know about the situation, are there specific actions that you would characterize as having increased the inherent riskiness of the event as it was designed?
Oh, sure. I think there were several things that that are called into question. Now, I keep in mind I'm not an expert, and I read a lot and I follow a lot of fitness, and particularly around the CrossFit field. But from what I could see, probably the 2 to 3 biggest risks that were presenting to themselves was one. You had a very hot day, so you're in a high heat environment in Texas. It was early morning, but still hot, and particularly for those athletes that hadn't acclimated yet, you get half the fields from Europe, and they don't deal with Texas heat by any stretch of the imagination. Um, you're leading off with a 3.5 mile run, and then you're immediately into water, and the water's warm. Now, it's my understanding for triathlons, kind of the cutoff temp for water temp is like 87 degrees. And I think the water temp at that point was like maybe 85, 86. So they're right on the edge of where they should be. You also don't have bright colored caps and like tow buoys on the athletes. So they don't have any personal safety equipment that makes them where you can see them visually in the water. You had a large open space, and you did not have an overwhelming amount of safety, of people on paddle boards. So when you've got 80 swimmers, of which the vast majority of them are not professional swimmers. The irony is the athlete who passed away was a professional swimmer, but most of them aren't. And you don't have overwhelming support for these athletes. It's a big risk, and you're putting the swim second. So you're swimming in your most exhausted state. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of the opposite of what all triathlons do. Like triathlons have, it's my understanding, 20 or 30 deaths a year in the swimming portion because it's a very dangerous event, and they're typically in ocean water, but it's still a very dangerous moment in the workout, and they intentionally put it first for that reason, because you want to be in your least exhausted state to do it. And so I think you combine all of those factors, and it certainly raises scrutiny around how safe was it comparatively.
And how aware, right, of the people who made those programming decisions, how aware were they, right, of all of those factors, right? So I think one thing that may also not be obvious to non-CrossFitters, right, is that part of the reason why it's very difficult to make changes to CrossFit competition programming is sort of this element of surprise, right? And sort of the short window of common knowledge about what the actual competition event, like what the event is going to consist of. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Like just how, when you have been to the games, is it kind of, are you getting hints of what the event is going to be based on setup? Like, how much do you think athletes know or are prepared for the challenge that they're about to face?
Well, this one they knew. So usually the events, well, not usually, part of the time, the events are a total surprise. They'll find out, an hour beforehand, or sometimes right on the spot. Sometimes the events are released in advance. This one had been released in advance. The PFAA had actually petitioned CrossFit with worries of the heat index and asked to be notified of what workouts would be outside so that everyone could prepare for it. And to CrossFit's credit, they released this one. Everyone knew what it was going in. I think the thing that a lot of people probably aren't thinking about, and I would not have thought about prior to this event either, is you have a lot of athletes and the people designing the workouts that have never done these type of workouts. Like they're not professional triathletes, and so they're just simply putting the workouts together and then testing them with other professional athletes and, using that as their benchmark for what it's going to look like, feel like, how people are going to react to the workout and determine what changes they need to be made. Do they need to make it harder or less difficult based on that? And so they don't have a deep, rich history of understanding maybe the inherent risks as they should.
And the demo team that tests the workouts, they don't do that super far in advance, though, right? It's kind of in close proximity to the actual competition.
It depends, but I think I actually saw that they were testing this one like the day before, maybe because they wanted to test it in the heat and see what it felt like and all of that. And it's, I respect the fact that they're doing that. I'm not sure that's a fair test to have 5 athletes doing what 80 people have to do. Like, you get 5 people, it's fine for, but it's not a big enough baseline to really understand what you're seeing.
Well, there's obviously also a very different level of intensity when you're competing for hundreds of thousands of dollars versus, just kind of going through the workout like it's your job, right? So then the next hurdle in a civil claim is the waiver of liability that all athletes most likely signed to participate in the games. The state of Texas, and again, this is just an assumption, but the state of Texas does not seem inclined to enforce pre-accident waivers of gross negligence, which, is a matter of public policy and definitely a good practice. So, if the games organizers were found, or whoever was named in a civil suit was found to be grossly negligent, then a claim filed on Lazar's behalf could be successful. But gross negligence is a very high standard. It requires a showing that when viewed objectively from whoever the defendants may be, from their standpoint, that at the time of the event, the act or acts or omissions involved an extreme degree of risk. And they had actual subjective awareness of the risk involved, but proceeded anyway. So I'm not going to ask you to do a legal analysis of that. I think what I actually am more interested to know is what your thoughts are. And again, you're an affiliate owner, so you have some different perspectives on this. But, what are your thoughts on the inclusion of these types of provisions in as standard in participant, waivers and agreements to, it's not really like the athletes have a choice whether or not to agree to this. They've spent all year preparing and trying to qualify for the games. And so then, there is certainly an imbalance of power. Should we be attempting to, as organizations who run these types of events, absolve ourselves of liability only in the most egregious situations where we have, breached our ethical and, human duty to our athletes?
I don't really have a problem, I guess, with the organization asking for a waiver prior to the event. Like, we ask all of our affiliate members to sign a waiver before they work out with us, right? It's like there's an inherent risk to what everyone is doing, and you do want to protect the business. But in the view of the games, I'd feel better about the waivers if the athletes had a better union that was advocating on their behalf and helping create that waiver. To your point, there's an imbalance of power. The corporation holds all of it. The athletes have none of it. So they get no say. And one athlete going, well, I don't want to sign this waiver, they're just going to give them the finger and say, well, good luck not competing then. Right? Like, I'm not
Right.
trying to make light of it, but that's what would happen. You need every athlete to stand up and say, I'm not competing. And bluntly, they'd have to do it on game day to make a real impact. And so, I think, no one ever expected it to come to this ever. I think we've always had this feeling that because CrossFit's so good for us and we love it, that everyone has the best of intentions. And I hope something that will come out of this is that we start questioning more of these types of things and creating an environment that's good for both parties. Like I don't want to see, the competition get screwed either, but I do think there's a balance where you want it to be safe and equitable for everyone involved. And because I want to say it out loud, there's no one at CrossFit headquarters that isn't absolutely devastated today.
Right.
Every single one of them. I guarantee, like everyone I've talked to, they're like zombies right now. Like they are absolutely destroyed. So there was no intent to hurt or injure or maim or any of that. Like
Right.
they just thought they were creating a workout that looked challenging and people would enjoy watching. And the
And I
work.
agree. And that's kind of why I bring this up, though, is that I think it is a ridiculously high bar that's really, something that only very, remote kind of inhuman
Right.
entities like really ever reach. I think that's kind of my point, is that there's no way that anybody involved in the games had any awareness, actual knowledge or awareness of the risks that this event could pose, and then said, "Let's go ahead with it anyway."
Right.
I don't believe that either. But that's my kind of my point. That's the challenge.
Yeah.
So I know that you just released, which I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, an episode about the future of the games.
Right.
So this is going to air well after people have had a chance to listen to yours. So I don't think I'm asking you to give any spoilers in saying, well, what are your thoughts about what the future holds?
Yeah, people have had big feelings about that video already. I tried to walk a line of not ranting about where I think the game's failed and spend more time talking about where I think they need to go. I think it's super important that that they focus on the PFAA for one. I think that's part of what they need to do. I think that they need a better relationship. They've got this kind of long-standing culture of not listening to others, and being a better collaborator with them will certainly help. I think that this third-party independent review they have going on right now is a great first step. But I was trying to level set with the community that they need to understand they're not going to get the transparency they're looking for. Like everyone's, I've already heard people saying, I can't wait to hear all the details. And, I work in corporate America. I'm like, you're going to get very few of the details. Like
Right.
from a
They'll be focused on this one event, not on the broader landscape. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then outside of that, I spent a lot of time just discussing the culture of it and the lack of change that's happened there, and that if they really want to fix the business long term, they've got to look inside, not outside. Like this is a them problem, and the sooner that they can recognize that they need to lock arms and do what's best for the community as opposed to whatever's happening in their little fiefdoms, the better we're all going to be.
So one of the things that has been tossed out that I've heard is that perhaps CrossFit should stop hosting the games, that they should turn that responsibility over to another entity who's shown themselves to be perhaps better equipped or better able to work with athletes, to treat athletes as professionals. The Rogue Invitational is one example that I've heard of that, but also, Wadapalooza, entered into like a compact with the PFAA and made a number of very clear and unambiguous promises to athletes participating. And so, more than a couple people have said to me that they should be run. One of those organizations is better equipped to run the games. I'm curious what your thoughts would be about a change like that and what the impact might be on the brand if they give up sort of this title event.
Well, I think prior to this, there would have been no chance of them even considering giving it up. That's, kind of your first hurdle is, how are you going to talk CrossFit into giving away the CrossFit games? So it's pretty hard sell. I do think that there are, I mean, you named the two that run really good events that have, as much history. Well, Rogue doesn't have as much, but they're great at it, of running good events and making them safe and viewer friendly at the same time. Um, for the point though, I think CrossFit games have been, safe up until this moment with, obviously some exceptions here and there. I think, from as a viewer, you view these things as it's a sporting event. It's like watching NFL football. Someone's going to get hurt. You just know it's going to happen. You just never expect it to be the worst. So I think we've viewed all of them that way. But I think that one of those organizations running the CrossFit Games, not a terrible idea. It takes some of the liability off CrossFit, takes a lot of the work off of them so they can actually focus on their North Star, which is growing affiliates. That's what they want to do anyway. And I've never been a huge fan of the sport to begin with. So I think a lot of us in the affiliates, if the games went away altogether, we probably wouldn't bat an eye at it much. We want to help people battle chronic disease, not train to do the most pull-ups. So I think if you could find someone that could run it the right way and it would still be a good representation of the brand, it would be worth it for them. I think it's certainly not off the table. I mean, you have a private equity owner that's probably questioning everything right now and thinking, kind of what's next down the line. So I don't think it wouldn't shock me to see them sell it. It wouldn't shock me to see them close it altogether. It wouldn't shock me to see them go on business as usual. There's too many variables at play right now to really understand, but I'd be a fan if one of them, one of those two competitions picked it up.
What are the consequences, though, to the athletes who have really kind of established themselves as professionals in the sport if there isn't, a CrossFit Games and that there's just these, big competitions around, the world here and there, with their own rules, their own eligibility, their own unique structures and challenges and safety protocols, but without really the CrossFit brand attached to it.
Well, I think and it's a huge if and hypothetical, if the CrossFit Games cease to exist, I think somebody else would pick up the mantle. You can see it with High Rocks as an example of a sport that's come into the space 2 years ago, and now they're, seems like they're thriving.
They are, but High Rocks and CrossFit, I gotta say, they include some similar movements, but
no, they're different.
They're so different.
Yeah, I only use them as an example, though, to say that it's proof point that there is a want and a desire for competitive fitness.
Yeah.
And I think someone would pick up that mantle like Rogue or Wadapalooza. Wadapalooza is already trying to. Like, they have 2 competitions now. They're launching their second competition this year. I suspect it'll be wildly successful. If CrossFit went under, I'm pretty confident they would name themselves the championship event, and all these athletes would go compete there.
Right.
And continue on just fine.
Yeah. All right. Well, any final thoughts or words to share?
Probably nothing too inspirational. I appreciate you having me on. I think, our community at large is reeling. It's been a horrific event for us, and there's going to be so much speculation going on. I hope the community doesn't lose sight that this is about Lazar and honoring his memory and fixing the problems that caused this, and that, we somehow find our way through it and find ourselves. This is a tight community that loves each other, and we want the best for each other, and it somehow has evolved into a lot of craziness somehow. And I think we all we want the best. We want it to be fixed. And so, I'm hopeful. I tend to be an optimistic person in life. So I'm optimistic that we're going to find our way through this, and, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And it is possible to get stronger and grow from, tragic events, and hopefully more people, more CrossFitters than not, will hang in there and hopefully be a part of the change rather than walking away.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much again. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and share your voice with my audience.
Glad to help.
All right. So